Hola, good morning everyone, Richard Wong here. Welcome back to the channel. Today we are looking at the Leica Q2, a full-frame fixed lens camera. And we are not looking at the normal Leica Q2. The one I have here is the Q2 Monochrom. This is not my camera. I borrowed it from my friends at Leica New Zealand. But I do have the original Leica Q myself. That's the camera that I really like. A few years ago when I went to Japan for a family holiday, my original plan was to bring my mirrorless camera and even a film camera for that trip. But in the end, I decided I don't want to bring too much camera gear as we'll be doing a lot of walking with my kids and parents. So I only bought my Leica Q in the end, and I think that was an excellent choice. The image quality is absolutely fantastic, and I found the 28mm focal length, even though it's not my favorite focal length, but it is actually really versatile as well. I even created a little video to share with you guys some of the photos I shot from that trip, so I will put a link at the end of this video and you could check out some of the photos that I shot during that trip using my Leica Q. And this Leica Q2 Monochrom is in a lot of ways a very similar camera, but also quite different as well. One biggest difference is, of course, this camera has a black and white sensor and is much higher resolution, but there are more. So in this video, I'm going to share with you some of the photos I shot with this Q2 Monochrom, my test results, and my thoughts about this camera. Does it really make sense to buy such an expensive camera that you can't even change the lens and you can only take black and white photos? We will talk about it all in this video. Usually I will start my reviews by talking about the body design first, but for this review I want to swap the order a little bit and talk about the body design at the very end. So let's start and talk about the camera's focus system first. Just like the original Q2, this Q2 Monochrom also uses a contrast-based autofocus system. I don't really have any real issue with the autofocus system on my Leica Q, and the Q2 comes with a few improvements. For example, there are now 225 autofocus area. I find the autofocus speed is a little bit faster and it works very well even under low light as well. But it is still a relatively simple autofocus system. You don't have dozens of autofocus mode and hundreds of autofocus settings that you can tweak. There are just a few simple autofocus modes. There is face detection mode and it works okay most of the time, but sometimes it does not detect the person's face when the person is not directly facing the camera. So I tend to still use the single point autofocus mode mostly, and that works great and it is very fast. There is a focusing tab on the lens, so if you want to do manual focus instead, you could press the button here and unlock the manual focus mode. Then you can adjust the focus manually using the focus tab similar to the Leica M lens, but the only difference is it is focused by wire. But since the autofocus mode of this camera works very well, so I didn't use the manual focus mode too much. But when I use it, I do really enjoy the manual focus mode operation as the focus tab just make the manual focus control very easy. The minimum focus distance of this Leica Q2 Monochrom is approximately 30 cm, which is not bad as you can see from my usual LEGO test photo. But if you want higher magnification, you can turn the macro ring on the lens to the macro position, and the camera can now focus as close as 17 cm, and that gives you pretty decent magnification ratio. The photo is pretty sharp as well, even if you are shooting at the maximum aperture, which is now f2.8 when the camera is in macro mode. I really like this feature as it makes the camera even more versatile. The only thing is, Remember, once you finish shooting your macro photo, you should turn the macro ring back to the normal position, or otherwise the camera cannot focus anything that is far away. I myself forgot about that quite a few times and wonder why the camera suddenly cannot focus on normal distant subjects, and turns out it's just because the lens is set to the macro position. I would love to have some visual indicator in the viewfinder or the LCD screen to remind you that the lens is in macro mode. For image quality, because the Q2 Monochrom is a camera with fixed lens, so we will have a look at both the image sensor and the lens performance. And let's start by look at the image sensor first. The Leica Q2 Monochrom has a full-frame 47 megapixel monochrome sensor with no anti-aliasing filter. The resolution is the same as the normal Q2, but because it is a black and white sensor, so there is no RGB filtering in front of the pixels. That means no demosaicing is needed and the sharpness would be great. And also, more light can be collected by the sensor. The minimum native ISO of the Q2 Monochrom is 100 and the maximum ISO is 100,000, which is double the value of the normal Q2. The increased ISO of this black and white sensor is a double-edged sword. Let's talk about the negative side first. Since the minimum ISO is now increased to 100, it means if you shoot with the camera's mechanical shutter, which can only go up to 1/2000 second, you may overexpose the photo if you want to shoot at f1.7 on a sunny day. Fortunately, the camera has an electronic shutter and it can go up to 1/40,000 second, so it should be fast enough to shoot even under the brightest sunlight. But of course, electronic shutter has its own limitations, such as rolling shutter. On the positive side, we have better high ISO performance. Look at these ISO test photos from base ISO up to ISO 6400. There is really not much difference in terms of image quality. Even when pixel peeping the 47 megapixel ISO 6400 photo at 200% zoom, the photos still look fantastic. It retains all those tiny details and there's very minimal amount of noise in the shadow area and the contrast still excellent. When we continue to increase the ISO, we will then start to see more noise and the image quality will start to drop a bit. But even at the maximum ISO 100,000, the raw image with no noise reduction applied still looks very usable. The contrast is a bit lower, but there are still lots of details in the photo, and with a bit of quick post-processing and noise reduction, the photo would look not bad at all. That is really not bad for such a high resolution sensor. In fact, this Q2 Monochrom is one of the very few cameras that I would be quite happy to shoot even at its maximum ISO. While I feel 47 megapixel may be a bit overkill as an everyday camera, one great benefit of such high resolution is that if I use the camera's digital zoom feature, I still can get pretty usable photos. If I shoot at 35mm digital zoom, I get a 30 megapixel output photo. Even at 50mm digital zoom, I still have a decent 14.6 megapixel output. At 75mm digital zoom, it is now down to 6.6 megapixel, which is a bit low, but it is still very suitable for online sharing or even a small print. The way how Leica implement this digital zoom is they make it pretty much like what you would see through a Leica M rangefinder. So instead of actually zooming part of the photo and display it on the electronic viewfinder or the LCD screen, just the crop area, it still displays the whole uncropped area with some lines in the middle of the frame to indicate what is the output area. Whether you like it or not, I think that is quite subjective, but I want to point it out to you. Let's talk about the lens or how it affects the image quality. The Leica Q2 Monochrom has the same 28mm f1.7 Lumix lens as the original Leica Q. I love the image I capture using my Leica Q. They are really sharp, very good quality, But let's see if it is good enough for the 47 megapixel sensor on the Leica Q2 Monochrom. First, let's have a look at the center image sharpness. At the maximum aperture f1.7, the center is already really sharp. Even when I zoom in at 200% and pixel peeping, the center is already so sharp. Because of that, stopping down the lens really make no noticeable difference in terms of center sharpness. Stopping down the lens to f2, 2.8, f4, there is virtually no difference in terms of center sharpness. The center sharpness remains excellent pretty much all the way until f11, when the diffraction starting to cause the image to be a little bit softer. And let's have a look at the corner now. At f1.7, if we zoom in and check the photo at 200% zoom, the corner is slightly soft. Stopping down the lens to f2.8 and there's some noticeable improvement. f5.6 seems to give you the maximum corner sharpness, and stopping down further, the corner sharpness remains quite similar until diffraction kicks in. In terms of lens flare control, the Leica Q2 Monochrom does a pretty good job. The amount of lens flare is well controlled overall. The contrast remains decent even when I'm shooting directly into the sun. One thing I do notice is when shooting at the maximum aperture with a strong light source in front of the camera, quite often I see a small round-shaped ghosting which can be quite noticeable. This is something I also notice when shooting with my Leica Q, but it seems a little bit more noticeable with the Leica Q2 Monochrom. With the 28mm lens, the Leica Q2 Monochrom is not really a camera to create some super shallow depth of field photos. But since it has a full frame sensor and with the fast f1.7 maximum aperture, you still can separate the subject from the background and get some bokeh balls in the background as well. The out of focus area dissolves very smoothly and I don't see any harsh edge around the bokeh balls. I also don't see any cat's eye bokeh effect. I think the camera renders out of focus area very beautifully. Next, let's have a look at distortion. Looking at my brick wall test photo and also some real world photos, I see a small amount of distortion, especially near the very edge of the photo. I think the amount is pretty minimal, but one thing I want to mention is, even though I'm looking at the raw photo convert to JPEG using Lightroom, I believe Lightroom has applied some distortion correction and it doesn't allow me to turn that off at all. I tried to use the EXIF tools to remove the correction profile, but maybe I did something wrong. I just can't really remove the embedded profile from the raw file. To be honest, for most users, it does not really matter and most modern lenses rely on lens profile correction to some degree anyway, but I thought I should point it out. Vignetting seems to be very well controlled with this Leica Q2 Monochrom. Even when shooting at the maximum aperture f1.7, there is already very small amount of vignetting, and once I stop down to f2.8, there is no noticeable vignetting anymore. The lack of vignetting may have something to do with the lens profile correction, but again, I haven't found a way to disable the lens profile correction to do any comparison. Usually when I review a camera, I will shoot in JPEG plus RAW so I can have a look at the image quality of the RAW file as well as the camera generated JPEGs. While the RAW file from the Leica Q2 Monochrom definitely a great, I'm actually even more impressed by the JPEGs produced by this camera. I'm not too sure if it's because of the latest black and white sensor on this Leica Q2 Monochrom or some Leica special JPEG processing secrets. The black and white JPEGs straight out of the camera just look very nice already without any adjustment at all. The image is sharp but not over sharpened. The JPEGs just look very beautiful and looks very natural and not over processed. Of course, if you process the raw files, you could have more control of how the photo would look like and you could probably get better image quality. But if you are not very good at processing raw files or just don't want to do any editing, you should be pretty happy with the JPEGs from this Leica Q2 Monochrom. The Leica Q2 and now the Q2 Monochrom can shoot 4K and Cinema 4K video up to 30 frames per second. The video looks nice, and even at high ISO, like this video that I shot at ISO 12,500, the quality still looks very good. There's a very tiny crop when shooting 4K video, but it's just really tiny. However, the camera has no microphone or headphone port, so you can only rely on the built-in microphone and you don't have much control over the audio. The continuous autofocus performance when shooting video is also pretty average. So overall, you can use the Leica Q2 Monochrom to capture some good quality 4K black and white video, but the video is definitely not the camera's strongest area. Okay, I save it till the last, and let's talk about the body design. This is, in my opinion, the most interesting and probably the best thing about this Q2 Monochrom. I could easily do a 30 minutes video talk about every single design detail of this Leica Q2 Monochrom. There are just so many things Leica did very differently compared to the other cameras in the market. But in this video, I will try to keep it short and I will try to focus on some of the most important things. But a quick spoiler, the design of this Leica Q2 Monochrom is really what makes it such a unique camera and offer you something no other camera in the market can replace. Firstly, as a full frame camera with a f1.7 lens, the Leica Q2 Monochrom is a very compact camera. It is made of metal, as you would expect, and the camera feels extremely solid. The build quality is excellent, high quality. It is just exactly what a premium camera should be like. The overall design of the Leica Q2 Monochrom is very similar to the original Q, but not exactly the same. For example, Leica has improved how the battery and the memory card are inserted into the camera. The camera has a IP52 rating, which means it is much better protected against dust and water. But overall, the design is still very simplistic. There are not that many buttons or dials on it. The Monochrom version does not even have the red Leica badge at the front. All the markings on the camera and the lens are either in white or gray. So yes, the Leica Q2 Monochrom has a real monochrome design that is very understated. Let's have a closer look at the back of the camera. It really shows the Leica minimalist design. There is a directional pad on the right, a small button at the top to toggle digital zoom, and 3 buttons on the left of the LCD screen. The overall layout is almost identical to the original Leica Q, but the original Leica Q has 5 buttons on the left, so Leica managed to remove 2 buttons, and it doesn't really have any real negative impact to the controls. I can still access all the most important frequently used features just as quickly on the Q2, and that to me is a huge achievement. Look at how most other camera brands design their cameras. It's quite often you will see them adding more and more buttons and dials to their camera when a new version comes out that supposedly make it easier for any kind of user to control the camera, but end up it make the interface pretty overwhelming. So I really appreciate that Leica is doing it the exact opposite way. There are less buttons, but there's also no real compromise on usability for its target users. The camera has a 3-inch 1 million dots LCD screen and also a 3.7 million dots electronic viewfinder. I use both of them a lot, maybe 50-50 when taking photos, but for the best shooting experience, I definitely recommend you to shoot with the electronic viewfinder. While the electronic viewfinder is not the highest resolution in the market, it is very sharp and very nice quality. One thing that I really love is that you can disable pretty much all the overlay information in the electronic viewfinder as well. If you do that, then you will look at the world in black and white, and there's just a little focus box on top. It really reminds me of the very basic viewfinder on my Nikon F film camera. With no other overlay information visible, I can just completely focus on the composition and just enjoy looking at the world in black and white only. There's no other distraction. My brain would work and think very differently. I only see the contrast, the pattern. My mind is completely trapped inside the black and white world. And because the camera only has very limited number of buttons and dials, there also isn't too many things that you need to worry about and adjust when taking photos. Focus point, shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, that's all. Just the very fundamental settings. And again, this also helped me to focus on the composition, the lighting and timing. Combining it with the clean viewfinder display, my brain just doesn't feel overwhelmed at all, and the result is a very relaxing and enjoyable shooting experience. And when you click the shutter sound is very quiet, very soft. So you can barely hear it at all. If you want to use it for street photography, the quiet shutter sound combined with the low-key all-black camera design make it a very stealthy camera. The conclusion of this review is a little bit tricky. As much as I enjoy shooting with this camera, I can't really say I would recommend this camera to every one of you because it is a very expensive camera and a very expensive black and white only camera. To be honest, if I'm going to buy a new camera tomorrow and I'm happy to spend this much money, I'm not too sure if I would go with this Leica Q2 Monochrom, or maybe I would go with the normal Leica Q2 instead, because as much as I love shooting black and white photos, a lot of my photos are in color. However, if you are someone who really loves black and white photos, this Leica Q2 Monochrom is really the ultimate black and white camera in the market right now. Not only the black and white image it creates is excellent quality, but the whole shooting experience is just fantastic. The simplistic control and the ability to see the world in just black and white only with minimal distraction just give me that immersive black and white photography experience that no other camera in the market can give me. I would say if you really love black and white photography, this Leica Q2 Monochrom is probably even better than a Leica M10 Monochrom, because with an M10 Monochrom, the world is still a colorful world when you look through the rangefinder. Now, I can argue the price of the Q2 Monochrom is actually not that expensive. A Leica 28mm Summicron is already like 80% the price of the Q2 Monochrom, but the Q2 Monochrom comes with the latest full-frame camera and is autofocus. So yeah, it's actually good value for money. But let's be real. We are talking about Leica cameras, and Leica cameras are really not about value for money. Buying and shooting with a Leica camera is all about that fantastic shooting experience and enjoying a premium quality product. And over the last 2 weeks, I really enjoy the shooting experience every time I pick up this Leica Q2 Monochrom.